verse 30. And we'll pick up in 31, 29, 31, and go into chapter 30 by looking at Jacob's children later, starting next week. Today, however, we're looking at verses 15 through 30. So Genesis 29, 15 through 30. And the title of today's passage is Jacob Reaps What He Sowed. Jacob reaps what he sowed. Or another subtitle, if you will, could be God's moral law of reciprocity. God's moral law of reciprocity. Well, let's go ahead and read the passage, Genesis 29, verses 15 through 30. Then Laban said to Jacob, because you are my relative, actually, I'm going to start in 14 because it sets up the time frame. Laban said to him, surely you are my bone and my flesh, and he stayed with him a month. So our conversation now happens 1 month after Jacob arrives in Haran and starts staying with his uncle Laban. So 1 month after, verse 15, then Laban said to Jacob, because you are my relative, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me what shall your wages be? Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful of form and face. Now Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel. Laban said, it is better that I give her to you than to give her to another man. Stay with me. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of his love for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife, for my time is completed that I may go in to her. Laban gathered all the men of the place and made a feast. Now in the evening, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to him, and Jacob went in to her. Laban also gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah as a maid. So it came about in the morning that, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, what is this you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served with you? Why then have you deceived me? But Laban said, it is not the practice in our place to marry off the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also, the service which you shall serve with me for another 7 years. Jacob did so and completed her week, and he gave him his daughter Rachel as his wife. So Laban also gave his maid Milcah to his daughter Rachel as her maid. So Jacob went into Rachel also, and indeed he loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served with Laban for another 7 years. God's transformation of Jacob's character now begins in the ambiguity of the beauty of romantic love being frustrated by an insensitive father. Jacob's arduous labor for 7 years is mitigated in some ways by his ardent love for Rachel. Through the providence of discipline with grace, he will return to the land not as Jacob, but as Israel. Jacob, in the meantime, right now, in our story, is being humbled to become fit to rule his brother according to God's model of servant leadership. And it's interesting that I just said that, because if you were to ask me, what is the key word for the 15 verses that we just read, I want to point your attention to something. If you have a pen or a pencil, and you are the underlying kind, look at the passage with me. I will submit to you that the key word in these 15 verses is the word serve. In fact, that key word is mentioned 7 times in these verses. So look at this with me. Verse 15, then Laban said to Jacob, because you are my relative, should you therefore serve me? Verse 18, now Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, I will serve you. Verse 20, so Jacob served 7 years. Verse 25, was it not for Rachel that I served you? Verse 27, complete the week of this one, we will give you the other one also for the service which you shall serve twice in that one verse, and finally verse 30. So Jacob went into Rachel also, and indeed he loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served with Laban for another 7 years. So it's interesting. The word serve kind of encapsulates this entire passage. It starts in verse 15, and it is mentioned at the end in verse 30. So that is probably the key word for the passage that we're looking today, which is very fitting, because what is God doing with Jacob in this passage? He is preparing him to be a servant leader. You see, Jacob is promised, and he, through deceptive means, obtained that blessing that God had promised him in the first place. And the blessing entailed Esau, his older brother, even though it was maybe by a few minutes, but still, his older brother serving him. But before Jacob is ready to enjoy the benefit of his older brother serving him, God wants Jacob to learn what serving is really like. So for those of you who thought maybe, when a couple of weeks ago we were in the passage where Jacob deceived his brother, deceived his father, and really kind of dealt, I mean, let's be honest, he kind of dealt treacherously with, in the whole situation, in securing his birthright, securing his blessing, in a sense, really. And in case you thought that God just kind of overlooked that, today you're realizing that he didn't. Jacob actually paid 7 years of hard labor. Growing up in Russia, where I grew up, the words hard labor were really usually associated with sending someone to Siberia, where they really got to work hard in order to, re-educate them or whatever. And so Jacob, in essence, Haran was his Siberia, 7 years of hard labor as a result of God kind of showing him, this is what I think about the means and the methods that you went about in accomplishing what my goal for you was. So the end doesn't justify the means, as our society likes us to think sometimes. God doesn't only care about the end, he also cares about the means. That's the reason for the fruit of the Spirit, in fact, in the New Testament. Because God wants us to not only do what is right, but he also wants us to go about it the right way via love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So that's kind of an interesting piece here. So Jacob, as we're looking at the first point, verses 15 through 20, Jacob makes a deal with Laban to work off Rachel's dowry in 7 years. So that's the first point. Jacob makes a deal with Laban to work off Rachel's dowry in 7 years. Jacob was there to learn how to work. That's what God had him there for. And how to serve, and in essence, how to become a man. Why do I say that? Well, we get the picture of Jacob from the story prior to that, of being more of a mama's boy. And, when I say mama's boy, you probably think of a teenager. Here's what's even worse about this picture. He's mama's boy, and he's in his 70s, okay? Now, the only person that I can think of like that is the current king of England, because he was kind of living in the shadow of his mother, and he was mama's boy, that all he was doing was just waiting to assume her throne. And because Elizabeth was such a God-fearing woman, God kept her alive for a long time, until her 90s, so that the mama's boy son of her, who was destined to become the next king, wouldn't really get a chance to mess up, England too much in a few years that he probably has. So that's kind of what I think of, and I'm just being semi-joking here. I really don't have nothing to do with English politics, and I really don't care what happens there. But in my mind, that's kind of what came to my mind as a modern day example of what Jacob was. Because in my mind, outside of that, I can't really imagine someone in their 70s still being a mama's boy in a sense. Because that's kind of what we see. We see him before not really using his own mind, going along with his mother's recommendation for how to steal the blessing, right? And just really kind of being in the shadows. And so here, what God is doing with Jacob is he is teaching him how to become a man. The good news is is that it's not too late to learn how to become a man, even when you're in your 70s. So if there's anyone here in their 70s and they still don't know how to be a man, God can still teach you. That's the good news. And you can see Jacob being an example of that, and that's a great encouragement for us. But you know what else is really encouraging about this story here is that I really love this about the way that God functions, because obviously, as I already mentioned, Jacob needed some discipline. Jacob needed to learn a few things. Jacob needed to learn about the fact that the end doesn't justify the means also matter. But in the way that, just like God often does, he does not allow Jacob's time in Haran, which, as we already mentioned, was really necessary for Jacob's development for the next stage of his life. God is not allowing this time to be the time of only pain and only hardship and only hard labor. God infuses some grace into these 14 years. He infuses some joy. He infuses some love. And isn't that the way God deals with us? When we find ourselves unexplainably in a difficult time in our lives or in unexplainable circumstances in our lives, and we know that God is doing something, God is developing something, God is growing something within us, what I have found, even in my short 51 years on this life, on this earth, I've found that never have those times been just pure dread, pure misery, pure hardship. God has inadvertently and consistently and faithfully always infused some joy, some grace, some love, some relief, some provision, some protection. And that's just how God functions. And so even our story today is not just a story of hard labor, because that's how God works. And so here, Laban, as we look at this passage, we can continue working through it. In verse 15, Laban offers to pay Jacob for his work. We're still in point 1. And, you know, as we look at that offer, it may sound kind of gracious and may sound kind of nice of Laban. But if we step back for a second, what Laban probably should have done as a loving relative is to help Jacob get a start on building his own home. As Jacob asks of Laban in chapter 30, verses 25 through 34. Instead of, as a relative, helping his nephew kind of start his own life, instead what Laban does is he keeps Jacob as nothing more than a laborer under contract. And in fact, if you want to know the kind of contract that he's, hold one finger here and go to chapter 31. We'll get to it in a few weeks. But in chapter 31, as Jacob is finally fed up with what has gone on, I want you to know exactly what has gone on as Jacob is beginning this 20-year period. This is what happens to him over 20 years. Look at verse 41 of chapter 31. This happens at the end of the 20-year period as Jacob finally takes off and Laban pursues him. And Jacob has an opportunity to honestly tell Laban what has happened and how he has felt about it. This is what Jacob says to Laban. These 20 years I have been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock. And you changed my wages 10 times. Have you ever worked for an employer that has changed your wages 10 times? I would suspect that the changes were not upward. I would suspect that because of the complaint, the changes were downward. Can you imagine getting your salary adjusted 10 times further and further slashed down? If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been for me, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God has seen my affliction and the toil of my hands, so he rendered judgment. Oh, and here's the other thing that he says. Jump up to verse 38. I forgot to mention this. Jacob said, these 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten the rams of your flocks. Basically what he's saying is, I have not taken advantage of you in any way, nor have I even, when I was out there watching your flocks, I was paying my own money for my food. I wasn't using your flocks to feed me. I was paying my own money. And further than that, he says, That which was torn of beasts, I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it myself. You required it of my hand, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. This is, by the way, is highly unusual and highly, I would say, gross and grotesque of Laban. Because you see, when it's kind of like me working something and there's an incident at a place of my work and something gets mixed up. My job, no job today will require me to pay for what gets mixed up because I'm working at, in the process of me doing work. But Laban actually made Jacob pay out of his own money, out of his own payment, the normal stuff that happened as course of his doing his job of watching his flocks. And so this just tells you, as we're going back to 29, this tells you what kind of arrangement Jacob was getting into. And this tells you that even though Laban's words may be really nice sounding in verse 15 and really smooth sounding, but you can see the true nature of a man. This is not the kind of man that he appears to be. Laban's smooth talk, really, at the end of the day, reduces Jacob to a lowly laborer under contract. Their relationship, as we just saw over the next 20 years, is that of an oppressive lord over an indentured servant paying off a bride price, not of an uncle helping his blood relative. We just happened to rewatch Fiddler on the Roof last week, and there's a young socialist that's introduced into that story who, after reading the story of Jacob and Laban, the application that he draws out of the story in line with socialist thinking, he said, so the Bible clearly teaches never trust an employer. I think that's a little bit of a misrepresentation of the true meaning of biblical text, but you can kind of see that as far as an employer is concerned, Laban certainly wasn't a good one, that's for sure. Nor was he a good uncle, for that matter, even taking that a step further. So what we'll learn as we keep going is that Jacob loved Laban's younger daughter. In verse 16, we learned that Laban had two daughters. The name of the older was Leah, which stands for cow. And the name of the younger was Rachel, which stands for ewe. And in case it's weird for us to name a daughter cow because you don't usually lovingly call a woman a cow. And she will definitely not lovingly respond to that when you call her that. But if you take yourself back in the context of the story, this is a shepherding family. And so these names are appropriate for a shepherding family. It doesn't have the same connotation, in that time as it does in our age. And we also learn in verse 17 that Leah's eyes were weak. There are a lot of different interpretations of what that may mean. Some say that it may mean that her eyes were blue, which was not valued in that society. Others think that maybe her eyes just lacked that fire and sparkle that the society prized as beauty in that age. Whatever that may be, we don't know. Some say maybe she was nearsighted. That may have been another thing, that the meaning of this. We don't know for sure what that means, but we just know that she is contrasted at the end of this verse with Rachel, who is described as beautiful of form and face. What does that mean? That just means that she had a nice figure and a beautiful face. That's all that means here, and that's what we know about them. And we also know that Jacob loved Laban's younger daughter, Rachel, and in response offered to work 7 years for her. And look at the next interesting subpoint, still under point 1. When you look at it when you read the next verse, verse 19, without knowing and appreciating Laban's true nature, you may think, Laban agreed. But look at what Laban said. Laban said, it is better that I give her. What we don't know is which her is he talking about. To you than to give her to another man. Stay with me. So Laban ambiguously agreed, and Jacob served him for 7 years. Laban's answer here is shrewdly ambiguous. He does not explicitly agree to give Rachel to Jacob after 7 years. Because you see, if it is truly true that they have a tradition in that time and in that land where you don't marry off the younger before marrying off the older, this is a perfect opportunity for a fully forthright man to introduce that information into the conversation. Oh, by the way, hold that thought, Jacob, for just a second. I want to be completely honest with you. What you're asking for is against our tradition, right? So he could have said that here. It's against the tradition. We don't do that. And so that was a perfect opportunity for an honest man. But Laban doesn't. He feigns this, getting really offended with Jacob. How dare he recommend? But he doesn't give him the proper information at the proper time. And what's interesting? We already talked last couple of weeks about the difference between the way that Isaac's wife is procured for him versus Jacob's method of procuring or meeting Rachel. The way that Isaac's wife was being procured, the way that Rebekah was being procured, you recall Abraham's servant came and he prayed and he asked God for wisdom and he asked God to bless his plan via which he was going to truly experience a servant spirit of the potential wife for Isaac. So he asked God to show him in a very short period of time. That's, by the way, the reason that we in our society today have the dating routine, is because we want to know that the woman I'm going to marry is a servant leader. The woman I'm going to marry is a godly woman. She's a righteous woman. She is a caring woman. She's a loving woman. I want to know that. And the way that Abraham's servant kind of bypassed all of that is by praying for a specific situation that was going to really show a true character of Rebekah. And God answered that. But we saw that juxtaposed to that, Jacob didn't pray. Jacob just looked at Rachel and fell in love with her because she was so beautiful. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but I am saying there is something wrong with not bathing your plans in prayer. And so it's interesting that we can kind of see the consequences of that, because the prayerless patriarch, as he's sometimes referred to at this particular point in his life, is not discerning enough to ascertain that Laban's answer is too ambiguous. So he doesn't see through his uncle's character and does not detect the ambiguity of her. But Laban here, the other thing that I want to say this to you before we move to the second point, I think it's interesting too that Laban actually treats Leah and Rachel like shepherds' animals, like commodities, for bargaining and trading. Later, the women use this business language to describe how they understood their father's treatment. See, it's interesting because in this text, as this is going on and as Laban is switching the daughters and all of that sort of thing, the author and the narrator here doesn't really give us a whole lot of a view into the thoughts and feelings of both Leah and Rachel. We don't know how they thought. We don't know how they felt. For that matter, we don't even know, we know that Jacob fell in love with Rachel, but we don't know if Rachel felt the same towards Jacob. The text doesn't tell us this. But it does. But when we do skip on to chapter 30, later in the text, we kind of get a little bit of a feeling of, or 31, I apologize, in verse 15, when Jacob finally gets tired and he decides, this is enough, and it's time for me to go ahead and go back to my land. And he recalls and relates his plans and his thoughts to his wives, to Leah and Rachel. Look at their response in verse 15 of 31. Are we not reckoned by him, our dad, is who they're referring to, as foreigners? For he has sold us and has also entirely consumed our purchase price. So basically they're saying we're like commodities. Not only has he sold us for 7 years of labor for each of us, but he didn't even give us a piece of that. He has taken that prize completely and totally unto himself. And so it's just interesting that you can kind of see behind the scenes as we're looking later at the text, that they had some very strong feelings about being treated this way. And so I just think it's kind of interesting here. And that is where you kind of get to unpack as you dive a little bit deeper into the text. And so that brings us to verse 21, which is the second point, is that Laban tricked Jacob and substituted Leah for Rachel in the evening. So Laban tricked Jacob and substituted Leah for Rachel in the evening. And that brings us to verses 21 through 30. So then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife, for my time is completed, that I may go into her. Isn't that interesting? Even the fact that 7 years later, Jacob comes back and has to ask Laban. I mean, you'd think that being a hard worker that he was. Oh, by the way, a reminder, in case you forgot from last week. You know, one of the reasons why Laban was so willing to agree to the 7-year of work agreement in exchange for his daughter's dowry price? Recall in the story that led up to it, when Jacob was wandering through the wilderness. Remember, he just made a 450-mile trip by foot through the desert. Anyone's ever done that? 450-mile trek by foot through the desert? Yeah, I haven't either. And so he has just done that. I mean, you know, that's an exhausting endeavor in and of itself. And so he finally comes up on this well, you recall in the story prior to that, and he sees some shepherds. And we learned that it was a cistern basically dug in the ground that had a large flat stone to cover the mouth of the cistern. And they would drill a large hole in the middle of it and put a big heavy stone on top of that hole to keep the water from evaporating. And you recall in the story that when Jacob came up on that well, it clearly stated that the stone on top of the hole was heavy enough to where no one man could unroll it, could roll it out. And so Jacob sees Rachel, he gets excited, he love at first sight, whatever else, and he is able to basically roll the stone away by himself. So undoubtedly that story gets communicated to Laban, and so Laban is thinking, holy cow, I get in one guy, I get the work of 3 people here. Yeah, I'll take you for 7 years working for my daughter. Working to work off the dowry price, I'll probably get the work of 3 people here in 7 years. So that's kind of what gets him excited to agree to this, to this arrangement. And so at the end of 7 years, Jacob has to say, hey, I've been working for 7 years. It's time to pay what I am owed. And so that's what he asked. Jacob requested to get paid at the end of 7 years. What does Laban do? Laban organized a wedding feast here. He gathered all the men of the place and made a feast. Now, there is alcohol involved in that. And so what Laban does is and the other piece that you need to know about those feasts, and that is still true in that part of the world to this day, is that when a wife comes or when she is introduced to the husband during this feast, she's completely veiled, right? And so what Laban is doing, he's counting on the cover of the darkness, the alcohol that's involved, and a little bit of an inebriation that happens as a result of that, and the fact that the bride is completely veiled. He's counting on those 3 factors to basically fool Jacob, for Jacob not to notice that he had gotten switched. That's what's going on here. But in the process of that taking place, God is working out his moral law of reciprocity. One reaps what one sows. In fact, if you don't believe me, keep one finger here. Go to Galatians. I just want to show you in the New Testament what God says clearly about that. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 7, God says very clearly, do not be deceived, through Paul to the church in Galatia. God is not mocked, for whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. So that's what Jacob is learning here. In fact, I want to even take it a step further and help you to understand the true parallels here. It's really interesting. As Jacob deceived his father with reference to what? Sight. You remember what we learned about old Isaac? He was about, what, 137 years old at the time. And we know that his sight was already bad. You know, this is before the contact lenses, the corrective glasses, and all of that sort of thing. And so Jacob deceived his father with reference to sight. So now he will be deceived. One Bible commentator put it this way. In Genesis 27, two brothers were exchanged by a trick before a blind man. In Genesis 29, two sisters are exchanged by a trick in the darkness of night and behind a veil which eliminated Jacob's sight. Do you see the parallels between the two? Isn't that interesting how God works here? But on the other hand, but here's another really interesting thing. This is how God works. Through a way that defines human logic, God is working out his sovereign purpose through the wrong wife here. Why do I say that? Who was the mother of Judah, David, Jesus? Leah, the wrong wife. And that's God. That's how God works. That's how God works. Jacob noticed that he was strict in the morning, but he was already married. We talked about the fact that we kind of learned how the girls felt about this in next chapter, or in chapter 31. And we understand that they had strong feelings about it. Then Laban used the excuse of a local custom and really strong-armed Jacob into working 7 more years for Rachel. So again, Jacob definitely didn't get away for what he did earlier. God allowed him to catch up with what he did and his deception in 7 more years of work here. But in the midst of all this, Jacob's character is being tested and refined in the crucible of living with his uncle Laban. Laban is cunning, deceptive, heartless, greedy, and ambitious. Jacob has already shown that he possesses many of these same weaknesses. But now, in this story, we're also seeing Jacob have faith. And in this scene, he also shows himself a man capable of romantic love, a good worker, and a man of integrity whom Laban can trust to fulfill his contract. So I want to tell you something. Again, remember how old Jacob is? 77. So the old dictum of you can't teach an old dog new tricks, wrong. You can. God can still teach a man about love and about work ethic and about all of these things, no matter how old you are, all the way. As long as you're connected, as long as you're plugged into God, God will continue to upgrade your operating system. And it will continue being updated over and over and over again. But also, there's another interesting thing. Jacob is also in the process here, at the age of 77, of learning a life of petition and praise. Even though no mention is made of God in this scene, have you kind of considered that verses 15 through 30, we don't see any mention of God? But what we know is that he's there in the shadow of providence, carefully orchestrating the circumstances in order to teach Jacob what he needs to learn in order to prepare him to progress from Jacob to Israel, who is the father of the 12 nations of Israel, even to this day. And I think we too can be encouraged by that. Because sometimes in the process of life, we go through life sometimes where God feels distant, or God feels like he's not there, or it feels like I don't hear from him. And even in those times when God feels distant or he's not there, we can be assured both from what God's word says and from our previous experiences, that God is there. He loves, he cares, and he's orchestrating things. And the way that we can be reassured of that, and the way that we can be encouraged, even through those times, is by petitioning and praising. Petitioning or asking God for help when you're overwhelmed, sad, afraid, nervous, and maybe unsure of the next steps. And praising him when he again and again comes through and answers our petitions. So really, at the end of the day, I think the lesson here is very simple, and the big idea is be careful what you sow in life, because you will reap it sooner or later. Be careful what you sow in life, because you will reap it sooner or later. Annabelle, can you put that image that we were talking about? The image behind me on the screen right now, in just a moment here, is one that has kind of taken the world by storm in the last 3 weeks. We all know what it is. It's kind of embarrassing. But it is a perfect illustration, I think, to what we're talking about in Genesis 29. We reap what we sow. And these individuals have sown in secret, and they reaped in public. And when we're talking about in public, we're not just talking about a few thousand attendees of the concert in Boston, Massachusetts, where Coldplay was playing. We're talking about, for whatever reason, this image has taken the world by storm and quickly went viral. And for those of you who don't know, the guy in the scene is a CEO of a multi-billion-dollar software company. The lady in the scene is his chief HR officer, chief people officer, and his wife was at home with their kids while he went on this office function to the concert. And as in sporting events and concerts, a lot of times you have what's called a kiss cam that just kind of goes through the audience and picks people, and people usually kiss, when the camera is on them. But this particular couple, who looked a lot closer than the coworkers normally do, in that left side of the picture, you can see the beginning of their reaction on the right side, and he literally ducked underneath. I don't know what hole he found in there, but he went into whatever hole was there, and she also tried to get out of the spot very quickly. But it's a perfect illustration of reaping what we sow. And their lives were destroyed, families were destroyed, jobs were lost, and it was just entirely not worth it. So I think it's a good reminder. Thank you, Annabelle. You can take it off. It's a good reminder for us to be careful in what we sow. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for